Pawn on d4 immediately claims central space, opening diagonals for queen and bishop. Developing the knight towards the center immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for further piece activity. Asserting central dominion, c4 immediately challenges black's knight and prepares to expand white's space on the queen side. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the kingside bishop, a very standard and sound response. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces the pawn center and prepares to potentially challenge black's central presence. Pinning the knight immediately challenges white's central control and aims to disrupt development. Solidifying the center and preparing for development, this pawn advance gently discourages immediate c5 thrusts. Preparing to fianchetto the queen's bishop, this move aims to control the long diagonal and avoid creating weaknesses on the queen side. Preparing to challenge black's bishop, this knight gracefully sidesteps potential pin complications, aiming for a more flexible development across the center. Preparing to challenge the central pawn structure, the bishop reroutes aggressively, aiming for an exchange to relieve pressure on the queen side. This pawn push aggressively contests the a-file, challenging black's bishop's dominance and potentially preparing a queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to e7 offers passive defense but neglects queenside counterplay, potentially allowing white to build a strong central grip. Initiating an aggressive knight maneuver towards the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's cozy development and potentially exploit weaknesses around the f6 square. Securing the monarch is paramount. Castling now prepares the king for safety and connects the rooks. Unlocking queenside space, white immediately challenges black's bishop and prepares for potential pawn advances. Boldly challenging white's queenside expansion, this thrust seeks to break open the center and gain counterplay. Challenging black's bishop with pawn pressure, aiming to seize more territory and restrict the dark-squared bishop's activity. Relocating the bishop to b7 now prepares for development and reinforces the queenside pawn structure, potentially aiming to counter white's pawn lever. Unlocking the c-file opens aggressive possibilities, forcing black into a more cramped development. Reclaiming the center pawn is a key step, opening up diagonal lines for your bishop. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest black's queenside expansion and prepare for a potential central push. Shattering the queenside pawn structure injects immediate dynamic play, aiming to exploit open diagonals and disrupt white's development. This quiet development prepares to challenge black's queenside pawns and potentially open lines for attack. Black aggressively stakes a claim on the queen side, aiming to restrict white's pieces and create an outpost for their knight. Securing the monarch amid the queenside pressure provides a crucial defensive cornerstone while eyeing central pawn breaks. Challenging white's queenside dominance, black aims to disrupt the pawn chain and create counterplay, though it weakens the pawn. Pushing the pawn forward intensifies the queenside pressure, aiming to crack open black's rocky pawn structure. Black immediately challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's queenside expansion and gain active piece play. This move centralizes the queen, creating pressure on the c-file and preparing for potential kingside action. Shifting the queen to d7 prepares for potential kingside operations and reinforces the queenside pawn structure against white's encroaching pawns. Securing the b-file and preparing for potential pawn advances across the queenside, this rook maneuver asserts dominance. Reasserting presence on the e-file, this offers potential for future pawn breaks and frees the f8 square for the king's eventual retreat. Preparing to challenge black's bishop battery, aiming to open lines for white's rooks. Exchanging the bishop clears the a-file and aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. Opening the a-file aggressively leverages the queenside pressure now that the bishop is gone. Shielding the queen with this maneuver aims to regroup and eye the center, but watch out for the potential outpost white might establish on d5. This repositioning attempts to reinforce the queenside pawn structure and potentially prepare a kingside initiative. Pushing the pawn here solidifies black's queenside pawns, yet it surrenders crucial space on the queenside for the bishop. Recentering the queen on the queen's side avoids the awkwardness of its current placement and readies it for potential pawn pushes on the queenside. Bolstering the queenside pawn chain now allows black to consolidate and consider reinforcing the center later. Seizing the file and adding pressure on the queenside, this aggressive positioning aims to exploit black's potentially exposed king. Exchanging queens now simplifies things, potentially leading to a pawn race on the queenside given white's advanced material. Opening the file now creates an active post for the rook, pressuring black's queenside pawn structure. The knight embarks on a daring journey, aiming to escape the queenside bind and participate in the kingside action. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside aims to generate attacking chances by drawing black's forces away. Establishing central presence and preparing for pawn advances on the kingside. Activating the bishop to contest the important light squares and improve its scope is the immediate aim. Liberating the knight to the center, eyeing the d4 square and potential breakthroughs. Seeking to exploit the slightly weakened kingside, white's knight embarks on an adventurous knight tour. Exchanging pieces on h5 significantly eases black's cramped position, opening lines for development and challenging white's central control. Unblocking the bishop trade now allows white to establish long-term pressure on the queenside and potentially exploit weaknesses. Strengthening the kingside pawn structure often comes at the cost of creating weaknesses. This move aims to fortify, but watch for potential future diagonal pressure. Recouping the bishop's presence to a more active diagonal now, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside. Challenging the kingside pawns disrupts white's central grip and opens lines for black's knights. Retreating the rook allows black to seize the file, a significant positional gain in this pawn-heavy structure. Securing the king's sanctuary with this maneuver prioritizes defensive solidity amidst white's encroaching pawns and rook. Securing the king's safety now allows white to focus on activating remaining pieces. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, this maneuver simultaneously prepares to contest the h-file and fortifies the king's haven. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, preventing black's breakthrough attempts and preparing a more robust defense. Shifting the king to a more active square prepares for counterplay and central control. The king bravely steps out, aiming to coordinate with the remaining forces and shore up the weak kingside pawns. Hoping to activate the rook on the queenside, a potentially long-term plan. Consolidating the rook on the open file, preparing to pressure the queenside pawn structure. Consolidating the rook offers a safer haven for the king, though it surrenders tempo. Sensing black's passive setup, white initiates a dynamic reshuffling of forces, aiming to exploit the open d-file and secure a more active rook presence. Consolidating the rook onto a more central square, this prepares to challenge open files and bolster the beleaguered kingside structure. Reclaiming the central file opens up attacking possibilities and prepares for pawn advances. The rook redeploys, seeking potential support for its advanced central pawns and reinforcing the defensive structure around the monarch. Reiterating king position signals a desire for central consolidation before any active pawn advances. The rook shuffles back, a passive retreat that concedes valuable central space and allows white further kingside development. Finally, the king steps out of the pawn wall, seeking safer pastures before the opposing forces can fully mobilize. A tactical stalemate appears, with neither side able to advance decisively, hinting at a potential draw if repetition continues. The monarch bravely ventures forward, seeking safer territory as the game simplifies into a maneuvering battle. A patient repositioning of the rook, seeking better placement and avoiding being pinned against its own king. Repositioning the rook to the file allows it to support a potential kingside pawn storm later. Reaching the same square signifies a repeated attempt to find a more dynamic setup, perhaps aiming to dislodge the rook from its passive guard. Rerouting the knight to its queenside is a patient repositioning, preparing for potential central advances or defensive maneuvers. The rook's repositioning aims to activate a previously passive piece and prepare for potential advances on the kingside. Unleashing pawns on the kingside aims to shatter the defensive pawn shield and open attacking lines. Shifting the rook offers crucial defensive flexibility, preparing to contest the now open g-file and bolster the king's safety. Consolidating pieces on the king's flank initiates a patient build-up, aiming to create weaknesses. Sacrificing a pawn to open lines for your rook offers dynamic counterplay despite the positional concessions. Capturing the pawn strategically opens the bishop's diagonal, potentially creating pressure on the weakened kingside structure. Initiating a central pawn break is a desperate attempt to stir activity in a stagnant position. Unlocking the e-file for your rook initiates a critical tactical sequence, potentially unraveling black's defenses. Exchanging this knight opens up the f-file and places your king in a precarious central position, demanding careful defensive maneuvering. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost, threatening the king and disrupting black's defenses. Reactivating the king's central presence offers a vital lifeline amidst this exposed position. Securing the king's safety by creating an escape square is paramount in this closed position. Consolidating forces on the 6th rank aims to prepare for a potential breakthrough or defensive maneuver. Repositioning the rook to the g-file establishes a critical outpost for attacking the black king's defenses. Shifting the bishop to c8 aims to support a potential pawn push or reroute for better piece coordination. Snatching the pawn opens the g-file, creating immediate attacking potential against black's somewhat exposed king. Trading pieces opens lines for your rooks and queen, aiming to exploit the exposed black king in the ensuing exchanges. Exchanging the rooks now initiates a clear endgame where white's passed pawn on the file can become a significant threat. The rook sacrifice opens the g-file, dramatically altering the pawn structure and offering a last chance for counterplay against the exposed white king. Recapturing the pawn on g6 solidifies white's pawn structure and opens the knight for immediate activity. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal aims to challenge white's pawn structure. Harnessing the knight's mobility, white aims to exploit black's exposed king and potentially create passed pawns. The bishop repositions, seeking to activate its influence on the queenside diagonal and possibly pressure the d-pawn. Activating the king is crucial now, aiming to centralize it and support the rook. Unveiling a rook battery on the newly opened diagonal could prove decisive. Unleashing the pawn advance initiates a dynamic struggle for central dominion and potential mating threats. Sacrificing the d-pawn now is a desperate attempt to open lines, but it leaves the king exposed and white's rook well placed. Snagging that pawn now opens the knight to a decisive fork, crippling black's defense. Sacrificing the bishop opens a diagonal for the white king, potentially creating tactical opportunities and simplifying into a favorable material advantage. This king's bold march to the center unlocks attacking possibilities and initiates the endgame's active phase. Creating a passed pawn is now impossible for white, but black's king remains exposed. Pushing this pawn opens a vital avenue for the white king's maneuverability and begins dismantling black's pawn shield. Stepping forward to control the center, black's king ventures out, seeking activity amidst the pawn storm. Pawn advancement carves out vital central space, potentially creating a passed pawn nightmare for black. The king's exposed position now becomes a prime target for white's remaining pieces. The king's bold march towards the center aims to activate its influence in this simplified battlefield.